I want to talk about, this is an article I wrote, it's coming on a forthcoming book. It's a book called Keywords in American and Latin American Studies. And the keyword I was given was Americanism. And my interpretation of this keyword is what I want to talk about. Traditionally, Americanism is something that is dealt with in American studies, for example. And it has to do with the expansion of the American spirit and American presence in the world. In Latin America, on the other hand, Americanismo is a long cultural and political tradition that is created precisely against the presence of the US in Latin American affairs. So you get two different constructions of what Americanism or Americanismo could mean. And I wanted to think about how is it that duality of traditions is actually manifesting in our daily lives here in California and elsewhere in the US in what I conceptualize as internalized border zones. It used to be the case that the third world was somewhere else down south. It is my claim that the third world and the first world actually coexist in our daily lives now everywhere in the US. And that this has created a coexistence between foreigners, and I put them in quotation marks because many of them are actually foreigners, many of them are constructed socially to be foreigners, just as any African American these days. I wanted to conceptualize then this coexistence of first and third world inside the US, not at the borders with Mexico, but inside the US in daily life situations. And those daily life situations I had in mind, and I'm going to exclusively talk about Latino border zones, but you could actually extend this well beyond the Latino population. The situations I have in mind are the situation of day laborers at the corner, at the big box store, seeking for work, trying to come into the economy, come in out of the shadows and participate. I'm thinking of undocumented students, of which so many attend UCSC and the UC system and the rest of the colleges in the US, and so many who do not attend colleges. Those students, people who are present physically in the US, yet have a difficulty constituting themselves into subjects socially, because they are being denied the access to subjecthood systematically, but who manage in these daily interactions to actually come into contact with Americans. And the contrast I want to analyze here has to do with the contrast, the contact between white America and these Latino foreigners. Remember, foreigners is always in quotation marks here. I'm also thinking of the field workers who grow all the food we eat. I'm thinking of the back of the restaurant where the Salvadorians, the Guatemalans, and the Mexicans prepare all the meals we eat. And so I'm thinking of that divide. If you think of a restaurant physically, and you think of that revolving door at the restaurant, where the dishes come out of the kitchen and into the front of the restaurant, that's the kind of third world, first world contact zone that I'm interested in. And that contact zone is producing all kinds of intercultural content, but it's also animated by a significant degree of fear and anxiety on both sides. And I want to concentrate for a moment on that fear and anxiety and try to think of the roots of that fear and anxiety. And then I'm going to move to hopefully a more hopeful reading of the situation. And I will finish with about 4 pages that I would rather read, being an academic than I am, than just explain. So in order to conceptualize these new internalized border zones as forms of intercultural Americanism, and that's what my article is trying to do, and I'm not going to bore you to death with the details of this, but I basically try to produce a synthesis of US history that connects a geospatial dynamic, which is the distinction between the inside and the outside of what the US is. And this is basically the history of manifest destiny extending west, of a republic that keeps on incorporating territories that it pretends are empty in order to reproduce itself until it reaches the West Coast, and then it begins to look down. And down it looks. And then it appropriates more and more territories. And so this geospatial dynamic that keeps on shifting what is inside and what is outside of the US, which, to summarize here, results in the incorporation of the Mexican-American population into the US, into this weird status. They are not the territory we wanted, we took their territory, and now we own them, but we don't know what to do with them. We have never left that situation. And I'm talking citizens here. These are the quotation mark foreigners that I'm speaking about too. The other dynamic is a social inclusion-exclusion dynamic, and it affects Latino immigrants as it affects historically Afro-American citizens. It's an issue of whether you are in or out of the social production of life officially. And of course, you're always in a sense, in a Marxian sense, you're always in, especially if you are the worker producing the things that other people are using. But it's about access to rights and the right to have rights that is systematically denied to these non-citizens or quasi-citizens, these half-baked citizens. An additional concept that I elaborate here is the post-social. The post-social does not mean the end of the social as such. Of course, the social continues to be in existence. What the post-social is trying to conceptualize is the change from a form of the state that we historically recognize as the welfare state. It's a state that is invested in creating not just the conditions for the exercise of political and civil rights, but is actually interested in creating the conditions for the emergence of social rights. So it's not just about voting or having the right to vote, which is important, of course. It is also about the right to education. It's the right to be healthy, to health. It's the right to retire in a dignified way. That welfare state, roughly 1940s, 50s, 60s, that welfare state extends throughout the world. It's not just a US phenomenon. This is the one we know best here. And that form of state, with all its problems, and remember, for example, the denial of subjecthood to African American citizens is coexistent, roughly, with the welfare state. It's improving in that process of civil rights struggle in the US, and it's in part improving because of the conditions created by the welfare state. It's integration of educational systems, for example, that creates that kind of access and that kind of social impetus for African Americans and their rights. That welfare state and the world of the social that welfare state created is gutted from Ronald Reagan on in the US, and is gutted from Margaret Thatcher on in Britain. And following the example of those two, bracket here, those two learn a whole lot from a Chilean dictatorship in Chile led by Augusto Pinochet that produces precisely the laboratory experiment of what the implementation of neoliberalism worldwide would be. But if we stick to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, those two produce the undoing, create what we now call a market society. A market society is not a society that has a market. Societies from time immemorial have had markets. A market society is a society that conceives itself as a market, in which competition is the basic law. And of course, we know that you cannot compete when access to the conditions for competition are not equal. You're not competing on the same grounds if you are not educated. Just as anybody now that doesn't have a college degree. A college degree seems to be the stepping stone to getting a relatively decent job to start with. If you cannot get there, and there are so many people who cannot get there now, you cannot compete. And then forever on, you will never be able to compete, and yet you will be held accountable on your individuality, on your own self-entrepreneurship to those standards, as if the field was actually level. The world we live in now under neoliberal state, competitive state, the state that is actually more interested, just as Ferguson, in policing their own citizens for the satisfaction of the tax-paying citizens, because that police conceives of those citizens that is policing as tax-eating citizens, undeserving citizens. So that new neoliberal competitive state that is more interested in policing some citizens against other citizens, so that some citizens, the ones that have power, will feel more safe in the world. Regardless of how the citizens that are being policed feel, that neoliberal state is what we live under now. And it's the one everywhere in the world people are rebelling against. Now, after about 20 or 30 years of very strong neoliberalization of societies. I'm not going to go into what neoliberalization of societies is really, but you know the drill. Is the effort to privatize education, is the effort to privatize every state enterprise, is the effort to privatize social security. It's an effort that you have lived in the midst of in the last 30 years, since Reagan at least. So having created that context, I want to be more specific now and read you about 4 pages, and I promise there are only 4 pages, about one of these forms of internalized border zones that I was talking about, and it's about restaurant workers that I want to talk. The American post-social space grows out of at least 3 great forces which, operating at the level of daily life experience of immigrants and non-immigrants, define the forms and possibilities of their interrelations. The global privatization of risk and social services, the global transformation of the structure of production and employment, and the national historic legacies of customary racism. These forces penetrate the bodies of migrants and non-migrants and organize their relations and experiences. This internalized point of friction between Latin America and the US, this border experience between immigrant bodies and post-industrial and post-social capitalism inside the United States, can be seen as not just the neoliberal form of contemporary capitalism, but also as its equal, if not more powerful manifestation in the realm of the constitution of subjectivities and the mobilization of affects. I'm sorry, it's an academic paper. I'm saying this form of capitalism penetrates subjectivities and regulates the form in which we interact with each other. My basic claim here will be that one of the central forms we interact with each other is fear and anxiety. And I know doesn't sound very hopeful. The problem is you need to understand that in order to be able to modify that. Because taking a page from Bruce a moment ago, you cannot change that program on your own if you are not a white person in the US. That program has been programmed for you by others with much more power to program than you will ever have. You need help in order to deprogram that, and that program does not only depends on your own initiative, that's neoliberal discourse, it actually depends on the relationship you establish with others and that others establish with you, the chances you get or don't get because of your skin color, or because of the fact that you have an accent, or because you have a different way of living your life. Anyway, we might want to consider then what are other cases in which the border between Latin America and the US is displaced and multiplied inside in the realm of daily life in the US. Among them, as I said, the city corner where day laborers seek work, the soccer field. I used to be a soccer player, and I realized that the soccer field is this particular example of this encounter between Latin America and the US, except that it's a different kind of encounter because for one of these contact zones in the soccer field, this capital, the body capital, belongs to the immigrants. They have a higher body capital than the natives. Anyway, the condition of undocumented students and restaurants. So let me refer briefly to this case of restaurants. In 1959, Irving Goffman analyzed the socially constructed speciality of daily life in back and front regions. I'm going to skip this. Basically, I'm going to use Goffman here to say this distinction between front and back regions of daily life is central to my understanding of how the social dynamics of a restaurant operate. And so a restaurant has a white side, which is the front side. If you pay attention, every waiter, every waitress will be white. Why? Because they are white, A, and B, because they can speak English to white customers. If you go beyond that revolving door to the back zone of the restaurant, most of the people cooking the stuff are likely to be people of color. Why? Because they are people of color, and B, because they cannot speak that English that well, and people mind the accent, etc., etc., etc. Oftentimes because they are undocumented. And if they are undocumented, they are extraordinarily productive for capitalism, because you don't have to pay those workers even minimum wage. You don't have to pay them overtime. They are incredibly productive. And their condition of deportability, to quote an anthropologist here, that is to say, the fact that they can be deported at any moment in their daily lives, that fact is what secures them in that position of exploitability. This I call here the hyper-flexibility of the Latino undocumented worker. You have heard this idea of flexible capitalism and flexible labor relations and flexible conditions of negotiation. Well, the Latino worker is hyper-flexible. There is absolutely nobody that embodies better the ideal worker of neoliberal capitalism than an undocumented worker. That worker has no right, cannot claim anything, cannot even go to the police, and is actually culturally very driven to work and work and work and work. The hyper-flexibility of the Latino undocumented worker is here again and somewhat perversely in evidence, as both that which qualifies them for back region, kitchen work, while disqualifying them for English-based front region affective work in the service of the white public, and that which also ensures their systematic exploitation as workers without rights. In the words of a manager of a French restaurant in Los Angeles, quote, "Yes, the immigrants just want to work long hours, just want to do anything. They like to work. They have large families, a big work ethic, and small salaries. The whites working in the front of the business have more, so they are willing to work fewer hours. Vacation time is important to white workers. The back of the house workers take vacation pay and then work through their vacation." End of quote. The case of immigrant workers in restaurants allows us to understand the dual and paradoxical productivity of a zone of borderization of everyday life, dependent on both the administration of mutual affects. I haven't explained this, but basically the fear and the anxiety on the white side of this equation comes precisely from the transformation of the nature of the state and the disappearance of all kinds of forms of security that were safeguarded by the welfare state. We all know that it's unclear whether, if you're white, whether the next generation in your family will be better off than the previous one. This, for 40, 50 years, defined whiteness in the US. You knew that it was going to be a better future. You knew your kids will have access to those things you barely had access when you were growing up. That was essential to the American dream and the whiteness of the American dream. And the grounds for that expectations have been taken away. And this is anxiety producing. Another factor contributing to white anxiety and fear about others is the globalization of the economy in the US. All those factory jobs have migrated. And they have migrated because financial capitalism is not nationalistic. It has no national allegiance. You know this from Apple. The case of immigrant workers in restaurants allows us to understand the dual and paradoxical productivity of a zone of borderization of everyday life dependent on both the administration of mutual affects, especially fear, anxiety, and resentment under condition of exploitation, and the mutual but unequal construction of social spaces and identity around the distinction of insiders and outsiders. In this case, migrants come into direct or indirect contact with the middle class that simultaneously fear and need them for the provision of services. You know, this is precisely the contradiction. White people use any number of workers under conditions of exploitation for nanny services, gardening services, construction services, all kinds of services. People in hotels, the people who do your laundry, the people who clean your shit, the people who, tend your bed, etc. Those people are used by white people all the time on a regular basis. And yet those same workers, when they are walking down the street in these white neighborhoods, are feared because they are seen as invaders. So this contradiction, we need them, we exploit them, we fear them. Undocumented workers in restaurants are thus an example of the forms of liminarity that affect, for instance, Central Americans in the US or many undocumented in global cities. It's, of course, not exclusively a US phenomenon. The social reproduction of fear in the mainstream functions then as a double threat. The fear of those immigrants racialized others that are, however, essential to the quality of life now. Without the work of these immigrants, life would be even shittier than it is under neoliberal capitalism. And the fear of the white middle class of downward social mobility, which is a very powerful fear. This anxious feeling affects a vulnerable middle class and even more so an extended segment of the US population. Sociologists have conceptualized this is about 50 million people of the 300 million American. About 50 million people fit into this special category that has been called the missing class. The missing class is those who are neither officially destitute nor comfortably middle class. And in about 30 to 40 years, that missing class of 50 million people, this is France plus size kind of missing class, has grown to this size. If currently the dominant theme in American culture is insecurity, this is because with the state-provided services retreating, risk is now unevenly distributed. Just think about 2008 financial crisis. That's what risk means for real people. Mortgage debacle, house prices going down to the hill, and as you know, African Americans and Latino workers and homeowners were the ones most affected by this. Good, I have 2 minutes, that's the good news, and the good news is actually I only have a page to read. But the case of restaurant immigrant workers in the border zones of a post-social configuration in the US can also tell a different story. Not one of fear and dread, but of real and potential alliances and solidarities. Chronicling the history of a pioneering organization in the fight for the rights of restaurant workers in New York, Rinku Sen observes that around this turn of the century, this one, 2000, there were in New York 165,000 restaurant workers. Approximately 70% of them were foreigners, and of them 40% were supposed to be undocumented. You see the numbers here, how crucial this population is to the functioning of this industry. Most of these workers worked and continue to work in the back region of the business, often under abusive and discriminatory conditions. In its exhaustive Behind the Kitchen Door report, the Restaurant Opportunity Center of New York establishes the existence of a clear racial hierarchy in the industry. The best jobs in the front of the house were reserved for whites, while the physically hard, badly paid jobs with no mobility were filled by foreign immigrants. While there are multiple testimonies of abuse and forms of reasoning that duplicate the racialized logic of the French restaurant manager that I quoted before about the exploitability of Latino workers, the report also contains many examples of what I would call successful transborder organizing, meaning when the back of the side of the restaurant and the front of the restaurant talk to each other and the workers actually talk to each other and overcome in intercultural contact precisely the separation of first world and third world in that restaurant. In the fight to recover denied salaries and establish common right, through these examples, we can imagine a potential form of politics capable of reversing the dynamics of racialized borderization of everyday life in many working spaces in the US. Rinku Sen adds, an organization that seemed to have nothing to do with white people, whose staff and members were overwhelmingly people of color, overwhelmingly undocumented immigrants, had turned out to be the one place where the white US-born workers could find a way to stand up for themselves. This is a fight in New York City about access to decent working conditions and better salary pays. It was led by undocumented restaurant immigrant workers working in coalition with the white workers in the front of the house, and they won. This is 2009. So it sets an example about how these non-subjects can connect with the subjects and change the conditions of subjecthood for everybody involved. This transborder organizing inside the US, this crossing the dividing line delimiting the border zones within the nation, speaks to the potential lodged in such daily coexistence of birthright citizens and those impossible subjects who are nevertheless denizens and who have nevertheless been expanding the concept of citizenship by establishing informal social contracts with the host societies and then demanding accountability. Thanks.